Venezuela challenged the U.S. Navy subfleet. The outcome shocked everyone. Let me take you back to March 13, 2024, a date that barely registered in the Western press, yet may well be remembered as a turning point in the unraveling of American naval dominance. That morning, Venezuela's defense minister, Vladimir Padrino Lopez, stood before a bank of microphones and announced that his country's forces had detected, tracked, and challenged a U.S. nuclear-powered submarine operating in what Caracas claimed were its territorial waters. The submarine, he said, had been forced to surface and identify itself before being escorted out of Venezuelan waters by a pair of Russian-supplied Su-30 fighter jets. The Pentagon, predictably, denied the incident ever happened. The U.S. Southern Command called it fabricated propaganda. And within 48 hours, the story vanished from the news cycle, dismissed as just another episode in Venezuela's long-running campaign of anti-American bluster. But here's the I've spent the last 3 decades studying naval power, asymmetric warfare, and the slow-motion collapse of U.S. hegemony in Latin America. And what happened that day wasn't just another empty threat from Caracas. It was a carefully calibrated provocation, one that exposed vulnerabilities in America's submarine fleet that the Pentagon has spent years trying to conceal. More importantly, it was a signal, not just from Venezuela, but from Moscow and Beijing, that the rules of the game have changed. And if we don't start paying attention, we're going to wake up one day to find that the U.S. Navy no longer rules the waves the way it once did. Now, before we go any further, let me be clear about I'm not here to peddle conspiracy theories. I'm not suggesting that Venezuela, on its own, somehow outmaneuvered the most advanced submarine force in history. What I am saying is that this incident, real or not, was a masterclass in psychological warfare, a demonstration of how weaker powers can exploit America's strategic blind spots, and a warning that the era of unchallenged U.S. naval supremacy is coming to an end. And if you think that doesn't matter to you, ask yourself how many of the goods you buy, the fuel you burn, or the food you eat travels by sea? Because when the Navy can't guarantee safe passage, the global economy grinds to a halt. So let's start with the official story, the one the Pentagon wants you to believe. The official nothing to see here. According to the U.S. government, the entire episode was a non-event. A Pentagon spokesperson told reporters that no U.S. submarine was in Venezuelan waters, nor was any submarine forced to surface. Southern Command, which oversees U.S. military operations in Latin America, released a statement calling Venezuela's claims false and irresponsible, adding that such fabrications are designed to distract from the Maduro regime's failures. The State Department chimed in, framing the incident as part of a broader pattern of Venezuelan disinformation aimed at rallying domestic support and justifying further repression. The media, for its part, played along. CNN ran a brief segment quoting defense analysts who dismissed the idea that Venezuela could detect, let alone challenge, a U.S. nuclear submarine. The New York Times buried the story in its international section, treating it as little more than a curiosity. And by the time the weekend rolled around, the whole thing had been memory hold, replaced by the latest Trump indictment or Biden gaffe. But here's the problem with this: it assumes that Venezuela is acting alone. It assumes that the Maduro regime is so desperate and isolated that it would risk a direct confrontation with the U.S. military over nothing. And most dangerously, it assumes that America's submarine fleet is as invulnerable as it was during the Cold War. All 3 assumptions are wrong. Deconstructing the what really happened. Let's start with the most obvious: could Venezuela have actually detected a U.S. submarine? The official line is that this is laughable. U.S. nuclear submarines, particularly the Virginia-class and Seawolf-class boats, are among the quietest in the world. They're designed to operate undetected in hostile waters, using advanced sound-dampening technology, anechoic coatings, and passive sonar arrays that can pick up enemy vessels without giving away their own position. The idea that Venezuela, a country with a navy that still relies on 1970s-era patrol boats and a handful of aging frigates, could track one of these submarines is, on the surface, absurd. But here's where it gets interesting. Venezuela doesn't have to do it alone. In 2022, Russia delivered a batch of advanced Ceres-1 air defense systems to Venezuela, along with a contingent of military advisors. More importantly, in 2023, Moscow and Caracas signed a defense cooperation agreement that included the deployment of Russian Kilo-class diesel-electric submarines to Venezuelan waters for training exercises. Now, Kilo-class subs aren't in the same league as U.S. nuclear boats, but they're extremely quiet, so quiet that NATO nicknamed them black holes during the Cold War. And they're equipped with some of the most advanced passive sonar systems in the world, capable of detecting even the faintest acoustic signatures. Now, I'm not saying a kilo actually tracked a US submarine. But what I am saying is that the technology exists, and the Russians have every incentive to share it. Because if Venezuela, or any other US adversary, can credibly claim to have detected a US sub, that changes the entire calculus of naval warfare. Suddenly, the US can't operate with impunity. Suddenly, every time a submarine surfaces near a hostile coast, there's a risk of exposure. And in an era where great power competition is heating up, that's a game changer. But the technology is only part of the story. The real question: why would Venezuela risk provoking the US in the first place? The answer lies in three: oil, sanctions, and survival. Venezuela sits on the largest proven oil reserves in the world, more than Saudi Arabia, more than Iran, more than Russia. But thanks to US sanctions, it can't sell that oil on the open market. The Maduro regime is desperate for revenue, and the only way to get it is to force the US to the negotiating table. How do you do that? By making it clear that if Washington doesn't ease sanctions, Caracas has friends Russia and China who are more than happy to help it push back. And that brings us to the most important part of this: the geopolitical cont. The broader geopolitical how Venezuela fits into the new Cold War. Let's out for a moment. The US is engaged in a three-front competition with Russia and China, one that assesses the Arctic, the South China Sea, and now, increasingly, the Caribbean. For decades, the US Navy has treated the waters off Latin America as its own private lake. But that's changing, and fast. Russia has been steadily increasing its military presence in the region. In 2023, two Russian Tu-160 strategic bombers, capable of carrying nuclear weapons, landed in Venezuela for joint exercises. That same year, a Russian naval task force, including the Admiral Gorshkov frigate, conducted drills off the coast of Cuba. And in early 2024, Moscow announced plans to establish a permanent naval base in Nicaragua, just a few hundred miles from the US mainland. China, meanwhile, has been playing the long game. It's invested billions in Latin American infrastructure, from ports in AMA to railways in Peru. It's the largest trading partner for most of the region, and it's been quietly exiting its military ties. In 2023, China and Venezuela signed a $4 billion defense deal that included the transfer of advanced radar systems and drones. And just last month, Beijing announced that it would begin joint naval patrols with Venezuela in the Caribbean, a move that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. Now, let's be neither Russia nor China is looking to start a war with the US over Venezuela. What they are doing is what great powers have always done: exiting their spheres of influence, testing their adversaries' resolve, and creating facts on the ground that make it harder for the US to project power. And that's where the submarine incident comes in. If Venezuela can credibly claim to have detected a US sub, it sends the US can't operate in the Caribbean with impunity anymore. And if the US can't guarantee safe passage for its submarines, then its ability to enforce sanctions, conduct surveillance, or even protect its own coastlines becomes a lot more complicated. This isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the slow erosion of US naval dominance in its own backyard. And it's a preview of what's coming in the South China Sea, the Arctic, and beyond. Military: why this should keep you up at night. Now, let's talk about the military reality of what's happening here. The US Navy is the most powerful maritime force in history. No other country comes close in terms of raw firepower, global reach, or technological superiority. But here's the thing about naval: it's not just about having the biggest guns or the fastest ships. It's about denial, the ability to prevent your enemy from operating freely in the waters that matter to you. And right now, the US is losing that battle in its own hemisphere. The submarine incident is just one example. Consider in 2023, the US Navy conducted a series of freedom of navigation operations in the Caribbean, challenging what it called excessive maritime claims by Venezuela and Nicaragua. But those operations were conducted by surface ships, destroyers and cruisers that are easy to track, easy to harass, and easy to deter. The Navy didn't send a submarine because, frankly, it couldn't afford to lose one. That's a problem. Because if the US can't operate submarines near Venezuela, it can't guarantee the security of the AMA Canal, a choke point through which 6% of global maritime trade passes. It can't effectively monitor drug trafficking routes, which are a major source of revenue for cartels and, by extension, the regimes that protect them. And it can't credibly threaten military action against Venezuela or Cuba without risking a humiliating setback. Now, some of you might be so what? Venezuela is a basket case. Russia and China are far away. Why should we care? Because this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the pattern. In the South China Sea, China has turned reefs into military bases, deployed anti-ship missiles, and built a navy that can challenge US dominance in its own neighborhood. In the Arctic, Russia has reopened Soviet-era bases, deployed icebreakers, and positioned itself to control the Northern Sea Route, a potential trillion-dollar shipping lane. And in the Middle East, Iran has shown that even a relatively weak power can disrupt global oil markets with a handful of drones and speedboats. The US Navy is still the best in the world. But it's being stretched thin. And the more it's forced to defend its own backyard, the less it can project power elsewhere. That's a problem for a country that has spent the last 80 years acting as the world's policeman. Domestic. Why the US can't walk away. Now, let's talk about the domestic side of this equation, because that's where things get really messy. The US has a long and ugly history of intervening in Latin America. From the Bay of Pigs to the coup in Chile to the Contra War in Nicaragua, Washington has treated the region as its own private playground. And for decades, that worked, because no one could challenge American power. But those days are over. And yet, the US political establishment still acts like it's 1985. Take the Biden administration. On one hand, you have officials like National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, who has quietly pursued back-channel talks with Venezuela, offering sanctions relief in exchange for democratic reforms. On the other hand, you have hardliners like Senator Marco Rubio, who has called for a naval blockade of Venezuela and even the assassination of Maduro. The problem is that neither approach works. The sanctions haven't toppled Maduro. In fact, they've strengthened his grip on power by giving him an external enemy to rally against. And the military options? They're a non-starter. The last thing the US needs is another forever war in a region where it's already deeply unpopular. But here's the US can't just walk away. Because if it does, it sends a message to the rest of the world that America's red lines aren't really red, that its alliances aren't ironclad, and that its enemies can push it around with impunity. And that's a message that Russia, China, and Iran are all too happy to exploit. Scenario: what happens next? So where does this go from here? Let's game out 3 possible scenarios. Scenario 1, the best case. In this scenario, the US and Venezuela reach a grand bargain. The Biden administration eases sanctions in exchange for free and fair elections, the release of political prisoners, and a commitment from Maduro to stop cozying up to Russia and China. The US Navy resumes its patrols, but with greater caution, avoiding direct confrontations. Russia and China grumble but don't escalate. And over time, Venezuela becomes a less hostile, if still authoritarian, neighbor. This is the outcome that the State Department is quietly hoping for. But it's also the least likely. Why? Because Maduro has no incentive to give up power, and the US has no leverage to force him out. And even if he did, the underlying geopolitical dynamics wouldn't change. Russia and China would still be looking for ways to challenge US dominance in the region. Scenario 2, the most likely. In this scenario, the status quo continues: low-level provocations, sanctions that don't work, and a slow-motion erosion of US influence. Venezuela becomes a de facto Russian and Chinese client state, hosting military bases, buying advanced weapons, and serving as a staging ground for anti-US operations. The US responds with more sanctions, more military exercises, and more rhetoric about defending democracy. But it never quite crosses the line into direct conflict. This is the most likely outcome because it's the path of least resistance. Neither side wants a war, but neither side is willing to back down. And over time, the US finds itself bogged down in a new Cold War, one where its adversaries are playing by different rules. Scenario 3, the worst case. In this scenario, things spiral out of control. A U.S. submarine is detected near Venezuela, and this time, the Maduro regime decides to escalate. It claims the sub was in its territorial waters and orders its forces to defend sovereignty. A Russian Kilo-class sub, operating under Venezuelan command, fires a warning shot. The U.S. responds with a show of force. A carrier strike group moves into the Caribbean. Russia sends more bombers. China deploys a surveillance ship. And suddenly, the world is one miscalculation away from a direct great power conflict. This scenario is unlikely, but not impossible. And the scary part? Neither side wants it, but neither side is fully in control of the escalation ladder. Grand the end of American primacy. Now, let's talk about the bigger picture, because this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the slow, painful unraveling of the post-Cold War order. For the last 30 years, the U.S. has pursued a grand strategy of liberal hegemony, the idea that America should use its unmatched power to spread democracy, free markets, and human rights around the world. And for a while, it worked. The Soviet Union collapsed. China was brought into the global economy. And the U.S. Navy ruled the waves. But that era is over. And the reason isn't just that America's adversaries are getting stronger, it's that the strategy itself was flawed. Liberal hegemony assumes that the rest of the world wants what America wants. It assumes that countries like Venezuela, Russia, and China will eventually see the light and embrace the US-led order. And it assumes that American power is limitless, that the US can police the world without paying a price. All three assumptions are wrong. The world doesn't want to be remade in America's image. Russia and China see US dominance as a threat, not a benefit. And the US military, for all its strength, is being stretched to the breaking point. The result? A world that's fragmenting into competing blocs, one led by the US, one by China, and one by a resurgent Russia. And in that world, the rules of the game are different. Spheres of influence matter. Red lines matter. And the ability to project power in your own neighborhood matters more than ever. Venezuela is just the latest example of this new reality. And if the US doesn't adapt, it's going to keep losing ground. What the US should do instead. So what should the US do? Here's the controversial: it should stop trying to be the world's policeman. That doesn't mean retreating into isolationism. It means adopting a grand strategy of offshore balancing, a realist approach that focuses on preventing any single power from dominating key regions, while avoiding unnecessary wars. In Latin America, that means 3. 1. Diplomacy over sanctions. The US should engage with Venezuela, not because Maduro is a good guy, but because sanctions haven't worked. A negotiated settlement, one that eases sanctions in exchange for real concessions, is the only way to avoid a full-blown crisis. 2. Deterrence without provocation. The US should maintain a credible military presence in the region, but it should avoid needless provocations. That means no more freedom of navigation operations that serve no strategic purpose, and no more threats of regime change that only strengthen Maduro's hand. 3. Economic statecraft. Instead of trying to strangle Venezuela's economy, the US should offer investment, trade, and development assistance in exchange for democratic reforms and a gradual reintegration into the global economy. The goal isn't to turn Venezuela into a US client state, it's to prevent it from becoming a permanent Russian or Chinese outpost in America's backyard. Now, what most people don't realize is that this approach isn't just about Venezuela. It's about recognizing a fundamental shift in how power works in the 21st century. The US still has the world's most powerful military, but military power alone can't solve political problems. And in a world where China is outspending the US on infrastructure in Latin America by a factor of 3 to 1, where Russia is selling arms to Nicaragua and Cuba while the US is bogged down in Ukraine and the Middle East, the old playbook isn't just ineffective. It's counterproductive. Let me explain why this matters beyond the Caribbean. The US Navy's submarine fleet isn't just a tool for projecting power, it's the backbone of America's nuclear deterrent. The Ohio-class ballistic missile submarines, or boomers, carry over half of the US's deployed nuclear warheads. They're the ultimate insurance policy, the invisible shield that keeps great power war from turning into Armageddon. And for decades, the assumption has been that no adversary could threaten them in their own operating zones. Venezuela's challenge to that assumption, whether through Russian Kilo-class submarines, Chinese intelligence support, or even just the psychological effect of a regional power daring to push back, exposes a vulnerability the Pentagon doesn't like to talk about. The U.S. submarine force is designed to operate in the open ocean, not in contested littoral waters where adversaries can use asymmetric tactics. And as more countries acquire advanced diesel-electric submarines, anti-submarine warfare drones, and over-the-horizon radar, the U.S. advantage is eroding. Here's the uncomfortable: the U.S. is still the dominant naval power, but it's no longer the only one with reach. China's navy is now the largest in the world by ship count, and it's building submarines at a rate that should keep American admirals up at night. Russia, despite its struggles in Ukraine, still fields some of the quietest submarines on the planet. And smaller powers like Iran and North Korea are investing in underwater capabilities that could turn their coastlines into no-go zones for U.S. forces. The Venezuela episode is a wake-up call. It's not that the U.S. can't project power, it's that the cost of doing so is rising, and the returns are diminishing. Every time the U.S. sends a carrier strike group to the South China Sea or a destroyer through the Taiwan Strait, it's not just sending a message to Beijing. It's also signaling to every other country in the world that America's attention is divided, that its resources are finite, and that there might be an opening to challenge U.S. dominance. This is where the establishment narrative gets it dangerously wrong. The hawks in Washington still talk about maintaining global leadership as if it's a birthright, as if the rest of the world will just accept U.S. hegemony forever. But leadership isn't about force, it's about consent. And right now, that consent is evaporating. Latin America isn't the only region where the U.S. is losing ground. In Africa, China is now the continent's largest trading partner, and Russia is making inroads with military contractors and arms deals. In the Middle East, traditional U.S. allies like Saudi Arabia and the UAE are hedging their bets, cutting deals with China and even considering joining BRICS. The U.S. can't afford to keep pretending that the post-Cold War unipolar moment is still here. It's not. And the longer Washington clings to the illusion of absolute dominance, the more it will find itself outmaneuvered in places like Venezuela. So what's the alternative? It's not retreat, it's recalibration. The U.S. needs to pick its battles. It needs to recognize that not every conflict is an existential threat, and not every adversary is Hitler. And it needs to understand that in a multipolar world, the goal isn't to control every region, it's to prevent any single rival from controlling them. In Latin America, that means accepting that countries like Venezuela and Cuba will have relationships with Russia and China. It means focusing on the things that actually matter, like preventing a Chinese military base in the region or stopping the flow of fentanyl from Mexico, rather than chasing the fantasy of regime change in Caracas. And it means using economic leverage, not just military might, to shape outcomes. The Venezuela submarine incident wasn't just a tactical surprise, it was a strategic warning. The U.S. can either adapt to the new reality, or it can keep pretending that the old rules still apply. And if it chooses the latter, it won't just lose in Venezuela. It'll lose everywhere. Now, what most people don't realize is that this shift in U.S. strategy, if it happens at all, won't come from some grand epiphany in the halls of the Pentagon or the State Department. It will come from the brutal arithmetic of domestic politics. And right now, that arithmetic is working against the hawks. The American public is exhausted. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan cost over $8 trillion, according to the Watson Institute at Brown University, and left nearly 1 million people dead. The idea that the U.S. can afford another decade of regime change fantasies in Latin America is a non-starter with voters. Even the most interventionist members of Congress know this. That's why you're seeing a quiet but unmistakable pivot in rhetoric, even if the policy hasn't caught up yet. Let me explain why this matters for Venezuela specifically. Maduro's government isn't just defying the U.S. for the sake of it, they're playing a long game, one that's deeply tied to the survival of their regime. And here's the uncomfortable: they're winning. Not because they have a better system, or because their people are thriving, far from it, but because they've mastered the art of asymmetrical resistance. The sanctions, the diplomatic isolation, the covert operations, none of it has worked. In fact, it's had the opposite effect. Every time the U.S. tightens the screws, Maduro tightens his grip on power. The 2018 elections were a sham, but they were a sham that the international community, by and large, had to accept. The 2024 elections? Even if they're just as flawed, the US will have even less leverage to challenge them. Here's how this plays out domestically in Venezuela. The opposition is fractured, and not just because of repression. There's a real fatigue among the Venezuelan people. They've lived through hyperinflation, mass emigration, and the collapse of basic services. The opposition's strategy of relying on US support has backfired. When Juan Guaidó declared himself interim president in 2019, he had the backing of over 50 countries. Today, he's a footnote. The Biden administration quietly dropped its recognition of him in 2023, not because they suddenly love Maduro, but because they realized the policy was a dead end. The Venezuelan people saw this too. They watched as the opposition's promises of a quick transition to democracy evaporated, and they've grown cynical. That's why, in the 2024 elections, even if the opposition manages to unite behind a single candidate, they'll be running against a regime that has spent years dismantling their credibility. But here's where it gets really interesting. Maduro's survival isn't just about repression, it's about co-optation. The regime has allowed a limited economic opening, what some call Maduro's pragmatism. They've loosened price controls, allowed some private enterprise, and even let the dollar circulate in certain sectors. The result? A fragile but real economic stabilization. Inflation, which hit an unimaginable 1,000,000% in 2018, has dropped to just 200% in 2023, according to the Venezuelan central bank. That's still catastrophic, but it's enough to take the edge off the crisis. The regime is betting that if they can keep the economy from collapsing entirely, they can buy enough time to outlast the opposition and the US. Now, the US establishment will tell you that this is all temporary, that Maduro's regime is a house of cards, and that one more push will bring it down. But that's the same line they've been selling for a decade. The reality is that Venezuela is no longer a failed state in the traditional sense. It's a hybrid regime, one that combines authoritarian control with just enough economic flexibility to keep the population from revolting. And it's not going anywhere. So what does this mean for US policy? It means the Biden administration is caught between a rock and a hard place. On one hand, they can't afford to be seen as soft on Maduro, not with Florida's electoral votes hanging in the balance. On the other hand, they can't afford another failed regime change effort, not with the American public already skeptical of foreign interventions. That's why you're seeing this strange dance of sanctions relief and renewed pressure. In 2023, the US eased some oil sanctions in exchange for promises of free elections. When Maduro reneged, the sanctions snapped back. But here's the sanctions were never going to force Maduro to step down. They were always about signaling to the Venezuelan elite that their future lies with the regime, not with the opposition. Let me put this in historical context: the US has been here before. In the 1970s, the Nixon administration tried to overthrow Salvador Allende in Chile, only to see Pinochet's dictatorship drag on for 17 years. In the 1980s, the Reagan administration backed the Contras in Nicaragua, only to see the Sandinistas survive and eventually return to power. In the 2000s, the Bush administration tried to isolate Cuba, only to see the Castros outlast them. The pattern is when the US tries to force regime change in Latin America, it often ends up strengthening the very regimes it's trying to topple. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a Venezuela that is neither a pariah state nor a US ally, but something in between, a country that plays the US, Russia, and China off each other to its own advantage. Maduro isn't going to invite the US Navy back into his waters anytime soon, but he's not going to let Russia or China build a permanent military base either. He's going to keep playing the game, because that's what keeps him in power. And that's the real lesson here. The US can't control Venezuela, but it can contain it. It can work with regional partners like Brazil and Colombia to limit Chinese and Russian influence. It can use targeted sanctions to pressure the regime without strangling the economy. And it can accept that, for the foreseeable future, Maduro is here to stay. That's not surrender, it's strategy. The alternative is another decade of failed policies, another generation of Venezuelans fleeing their country, and another humiliation for the US on the world stage. The question is whether Washington is capable of learning this lesson.
Because if it isn't, the next shock won't just be a submarine in the Caribbean. It'll be something much bigger. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the broader collapse of U.S. coercive diplomacy in the global south. The submarine incident wasn't an anomaly, it was a symptom. And if Washington doesn't adjust, we're going to see more of these shocks, not fewer. Let me explain why this matters beyond the Caribbean. For decades, the U.S. has operated under the assumption that military dominance translates into political control. That's why we have 800 military bases in 80 countries, why we've spent $8 trillion on the war on terror, and why the Navy's submarine fleet is treated as an invincible force multiplier. But here's the uncomfortable: in the 21st century, raw military power doesn't buy you compliance anymore. It buys you resentment, resistance, and most dangerously, alternatives. Look at the numbers. In 2003, when the U.S. invaded Iraq, 80% of the world's population lived in countries that were either U.S. allies or neutral. Today, that number is closer to 50%. The rest? They're hedging. They're building parallel institutions. They're buying Russian air defense systems, Chinese surveillance tech, and Iranian drones. And they're doing it because they've watched the U.S. break its promises, from the JCPOA to the Paris Agreement, and they've decided they'd rather take their chances with someone else's chaos than bet on ours. Venezuela is just the latest case study. Maduro didn't challenge the U.S. Navy because he's a reckless gambler. He did it because he calculated that the cost of defiance was lower than the cost of submission. And he was right. The U.S. response? A few more sanctions, some sternly worded statements, and a quiet retreat. That's not deterrence, that's surrender by another name. Here's where the grand strategy comes in. The U.S. has three options, and none of them are pretty. The first is doubling down on coercion. More sanctions, more covert ops, more naval patrols. The problem? It's already failed. The Venezuelan economy is half the size it was in 2013, but Maduro is still in power. The Cuban embargo has been in place for 60 years, and the Castros are still a cautionary tale. The second option is accommodation, lifting sanctions, reopening diplomatic channels, and accepting Maduro as a necessary evil. The risk? It rewards defiance and signals to other rogue states that the U.S. bluffs. The third option is a mix of containment and competition. Keep the pressure on, but focus on limiting Chinese and Russian influence rather than toppling regimes. Work with regional partners to offer alternatives, trade deals, investment, security guarantees that don't come with the baggage of U.S. hegemony. The Biden administration has been flirting with option 3, but half-heartedly. They've eased some sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector, but only after Maduro jailed opposition figures and rigged elections. They've re-engaged with Cuba, but only after decades of failure. And they've tried to counter China in Latin America, but without offering anything more compelling than the same old neoliberal playbook that got the region into this mess in the first place. Let me be: this isn't about Venezuela. It's about the future of U.S. power. The world is fragmenting, and the old tools of dominance, military force, economic coercion, diplomatic isolation, are losing their edge. The question isn't whether Maduro will fall. It's whether the U.S. can adapt before the next shock hits. And here's the next shock is already in motion. Iran is arming proxies across the Middle East. North Korea is testing hypersonic missiles. China is building a blue water navy. The U.S. can't afford to keep treating each crisis as a one-off. It needs a strategy that recognizes the limits of its power and the resilience of its adversaries. I'll leave you with this. In 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the U.S. and the Soviet Union stared into the abyss and pulled back. Today, we're staring into a different abyss, one where the rules of the game have changed, and the old playbook no longer works. The question is whether Washington will learn the lesson before it's too late. Because if it doesn't, the next shock won't just be a submarine in the Caribbean. It'll be a world where the U.S. is no longer the only game in town.